Welcome to Odd Occasions, where the bizarre and the terrifying collide. Today, we'll take you deep into the chilling aftermath of serial killers' gruesome deeds, focusing on how they creatively and horrifyingly disposed of their victims. From feeding bodies to animals to turning remains into everyday items, these killers took disturbing to a whole new level. Brace yourself as we unveil the top 10 most gruesome ways serial killers hid their victims. Let's begin. Number 10. Joe, the Alligator Man Ball. Fed them to alligators. Joe Ball, a tavern owner in Elmendorf, Texas, earned his nickname, the Alligator Man, for reasons that will send shivers down your spine. In the wake of Prohibition, Ball opened a bar to serve thirsty patrons, and his establishment quickly became infamous for the bizarre attraction he created, a concrete pool filled with live alligators. The show, tossing in live animals like possums, cats, and dogs for the alligators to devour while drunk customers cheered on. But the real horror began when women from the local area started to disappear, including Ball's barmaids, former girlfriends, and even his wife. By the time deputies arrived to question him in 1938, Ball knew the jig was up. He grabbed a gun and shot himself on the spot. As investigators scoured his property, they made a gut-wrenching discovery. The alligators were surrounded by rotten meat, and nearby, police found a blood-matted axe with strands of hair still clinging to it. Ball had been murdering and mutilating his victims, disposing of their remains by feeding them to his hungry gators. Feeding frenzy indeed. This is just the beginning of our journey into the horrifying creativity of serial killers. Stay tuned for more chilling tales as we descend further into the darkness. Number 9. John, the acid bath murderer Haigh. Dissolved them in acid. John George Haigh, one of Britain's most notorious killers, earned the nickname the acid bath murderer for his gruesome method of disposal. Between 1944 and 1949, Haigh killed at least 6 people, dissolving their bodies in sulfuric acid until nothing remained but a foul-smelling liquid that he would pour down the drain. His chilling admissions didn't stop there. He also confessed to drinking his victims' blood. Haigh had already spent 4 years behind bars for fraud after setting up a fake lawyer's office. When he was released, he turned to murder as part of a twisted get-rich-quick scheme. His first victims were a young man and his parents, whom he lured to his basement in London, killing them and forging documents to steal their estate. He struck again, targeting a wealthy couple. After shooting them, he repeated his sickening process, dissolving their remains and forging paperwork to take control of their assets. His final victim, an elderly woman, was killed for her jewelry, valuables, and her prized fur coat. When the police finally caught up with Haigh, he confidently proclaimed, "I have destroyed the victims with acid. You can't prove a murder without a body." Haigh mistakenly believed that without physical remains, he couldn't be charged with murder. But he was wrong. Detectives uncovered enough forensic evidence to convict him, and in 1949, he was sentenced to death and hanged at Wandsworth Prison. Haigh thought acid would erase all traces of his crimes, but justice still caught up with him in the end. Number 8. Robert, the pig farmer Pickton. Sold them as meat. Canadian serial killer Robert Pickton took the gruesome art of body disposal to horrifying new depths. As a pig farmer in Vancouver, he murdered at least 6 women between 1983 and 2002, using his farm as both his hunting ground and disposal site. His preferred methods of killing included injecting his victims with antifreeze or brutally stabbing them to death. But it was what Pickton did with the bodies afterward that truly cemented his place in the annals of horror. After killing his victims, he ground up their remains and sold the mincemeat to unsuspecting customers. Pickton's twisted operation went on for years, undetected by authorities. In one instance in 1997, a woman managed to escape from Pickton's farm, naked and suffering from stab wounds. She reported the attack to police, but her claims were dismissed as unreliable. Pickton's downfall came when he confessed to an undercover officer posing as his cellmate. When asked about the best way to dispose of a body, Pickton chillingly replied, "A rendering plant, a facility that converts animal tissue into materials like lard." It was at this plant that Pickton allegedly sent the remains of his victims, minced beyond recognition. In one eerie moment of self-reflection, Pickton admitted, "I made my own grave by being sloppy. Doesn't that just kick you in the ass now?" He also revealed that he had been aiming to kill 50 women, confessing that his victim count was close to 49. Picton was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Though he was convicted of 6 murders, investigators believe the real number of his victims could be much higher. For Picton, the boundary between farm animals and human beings blurred in the most horrific way imaginable. Number 7. Jong Yong Ming fed them to his dog. In 2012, Jong Yong Ming, known as the cannibal monster of Yunnan, shocked China with his gruesome crimes. Over the course of several years, Yong Ming was responsible for the deaths of at least 11 young men, and his methods of disposing of their bodies were chilling. He dismembered, burned, or buried his victims, but what truly set him apart was his other macabre methods. Some of the remains were fed to his dog, while other parts were sold at a local market as ostrich meat. Jong Yong Ming's dark history stretched back decades. In 1979, he was convicted of murder, but after serving 18 years in prison, he was released in 1997. Over time, young men began disappearing near his home, and their worried families feared they had been trafficked into slave labor. Yong Ming's reign of terror nearly continued unchecked, until one boy managed to escape after Yong Ming had attempted to strangle him with a belt. This near escape led authorities to Yong Ming's home, where they uncovered a scene of unimaginable horror. Human remains were found scattered throughout his residence, with flesh hung out to dry and bottles of wine that contained preserved eyeballs. The court condemned his acts, stating, "He used cruel means to kill the victims, and the circumstances and consequences were especially serious." In 2013, Jong Yong Ming was taken to an execution site where he was swiftly put to death for his heinous crimes. For Zhang, the line between man and beast was blurred in the most nightmarish way, turning his victims into food for his dog and grotesque wares for unsuspecting customers. The methods of these killers only get more depraved from here. Stay with us as we uncover even more horrific ways serial killers disposed of their victims. Number 6. Luis La Bestia Garavito buried them in a mass grave. Between 1992 and 1999, Luis Garavito earned the nickname La Bestia, the Beast, for his horrifying crimes that terrorized the streets of Colombia. Posing in various disguises, Garavito traveled to at least 54 different towns, where he targeted vulnerable young boys between the ages of 8 and 16. Many of his victims were street children, separated from their families and living on the margins of society, making their disappearances go largely unnoticed. Garavito's method was chilling. He would lure the boys by offering work or gifts, then walk with them for miles until they were too exhausted to resist. He would tie them up, subject them to brutal torture, and mutilate their genitals before killing them. His crimes were as cruel as they were calculated. In 1997, investigators uncovered a mass grave in a ravine in Pereira, initially believing it to be the result of a satanic cult. The grave contained the remains of 25 children, all victims of Garavito. He had been dumping the bodies in mass grave sites across the country, and for a time it seemed as though he might get away with his monstrous acts. But a crucial mistake led to his capture. Spectacles with a rare prescription were found at the scene of the grave, and they led investigators straight to Garavito. When police searched his apartment, they found photo evidence of his victims, along with journals that contained a sickening tally chart documenting his murders. Garavito eventually confessed to killing more than 300 children, with 138 of those murders confirmed by investigators. Despite his shocking crimes, Garavito was sentenced to life in prison, a sentence many believe was far too lenient given the scale of his atrocities. La Bestia's reign of terror left a trail of unimaginable horror, with his victims' bodies buried in mass graves, hidden from the world, until it was too late. Number 5. John Christie stuffed them into the walls of his kitchen. John Christie turned his home at 10 Rillington Place in West London into a house of horrors during the 1940s and 1950s. Christie, a seemingly mild-mannered man, was responsible for the murders of 6 women, including his own wife, Ethel. For years, Christie concealed his victims in the walls and grounds of his home, transforming it into a nightmarish tomb. Christie and his wife moved into the house in 1938, but by the late 1940s, the murders began. His first victims, 21-year-old Ruth Furst and 32-year-old Muriel Eady, were buried in the garden. Christie then killed his neighbor, Beryl Evans, and disposed of her body in a sewer drain. Tragically, her husband was wrongfully convicted and executed for the murder, while Christie continued his killing spree unnoticed. As space in his garden dwindled, Christie turned to an even more macabre solution. He began hiding the bodies inside the walls of his kitchen. 3 more women, 25-year-old Rita Nelson, 26-year-old Kathleen Maloney, and 26-year-old Hectorina McLennan, were stuffed into the walls, their remains slowly decomposing in the cramped space. The smell of rotting flesh eventually became unbearable. After Christie moved out in 1953, the new tenants noticed the foul stench and, during renovations, uncovered the remains of the women hidden within the kitchen walls. The body of Christie's wife, Ethel, was also found, buried under the floorboards in the parlor. Christie was finally arrested and sentenced to death. He was hanged for his crimes in 1953, but the chilling legacy of 10 Rillington Place lives on as one of Britain's most infamous crime scenes. For John Christie, his home became a grim crypt where the walls hid unspeakable horrors just out of sight. Number 4. Gary Heidnik fed them to his other victims. Gary Heidnik is remembered as one of the most grotesque and sadistic serial killers in history. In 1986 and 1987, Heidnik kidnapped and brutally tortured 6 women, holding them captive in the basement of his Philadelphia home. The horrors that unfolded in that dark underground space are almost too disturbing to believe. Heidnik's cruelty extended far beyond physical torment. He devised sadistic punishments, such as forcing his victims to stand in a water-filled pit up to their necks, then using electric wires to shock them. Former FBI profiler and Mindhunter author John Douglas, who studied Heidnik's case, later said, "Heidnik was worse than the character Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. The scenes of psychological and physical torture in his basement were nightmares made real." But what makes Heidnik's story even more horrifying is what he did after killing some of his captives. He dismembered their bodies and used a meat grinder to process the remains. Then, in a grotesque act of psychological manipulation and control, he fed the ground-up human remains to his other victims, forcing them into a gruesome form of cannibalism. Heidnik's reign of terror came to an end when one of his victims convinced him to let her leave temporarily under the guise of visiting her family. Instead, she escaped, found a phone booth, and called 911, leading to Heidnik's arrest. In 1999, Gary Heidnik was executed by lethal injection. But for those who witnessed or survived his depravity, the nightmare lives on. For Heidnik, his basement became a chamber of unspeakable horrors, where death wasn't the end, but the beginning of something far more twisted. Number 3. Albert the Greyman fish. Cooked and ate them. Albert Fish, known as the Greyman, is one of the most depraved child serial killers and cannibals in history. His gruesome crimes targeted young children, including 8-year-olds Frances McDonnell and Billy Gaffney and 10-year-old Grace Budd. While Fish confessed to murdering these 3 victims, he claimed to have killed many more, boasting that he had children in every state, and implying his victim count could have reached as high as 100. But Fish's reign of terror didn't end with the murders. He continued to torment the families of his victims long after their deaths. In one of the most disturbing acts of cruelty, Fish sent a chilling letter to Grace Budd's mother, describing in vivid, horrific detail how he had dismembered and cooked her daughter's body. He wrote, "I cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook and eat it. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body." It was this letter that led to Fish's eventual capture. The envelope he used had the address of his boarding house in New York City printed on it, providing the police with the crucial clue they needed to find him. When confronted, Fish made no attempt to deny his crimes, fully admitting to his heinous acts. In 1936, Albert Fish was executed by electrocution at Sing Sing prison, but his horrifying legacy endures. An X-ray taken after his death revealed that he had inserted dozens of needles into his pelvic area, another bizarre and grotesque element of his self-inflicted torture. For Albert Fish, murder wasn't enough. He took his atrocities further, turning the act of killing into a sickening form of culinary horror. Number 2, Dr. H.H. Holmes sold the parts for science. Dr. H.H. Holmes, born Herman Mudgett, is infamous as America's first known serial killer. In 1893, during the World's Fair in Chicago, Holmes built his notorious murder castle, an elaborately designed hotel that concealed a labyrinth of torture chambers, trapdoors, and death traps. While Holmes confessed to 27 murders, it's widely believed that the true number of his victims could be as high as 200. Holmes preyed on the vulnerable, luring his victims, mostly young women, into his castle under the guise of offering them work at his pharmacy. Once inside, he insisted they take out life insurance policies, naming him as the beneficiary. His victims would vanish within the walls of the hotel, where they met gruesome fates in rooms designed for murder. Some suffocated in airtight chambers. Others were subjected to lethal gas or dropped into vats of acid. Holmes's ingenuity didn't end with murder. He was also an expert in corpse disposal. Using his medical background and pharmacy connections, Holmes capitalized on the constant demand for cadavers at Chicago's medical schools. He dismembered his victims, selling their organs and skeletons to these institutions under the guise of scientific advancement. In a way, he was profiting twice from his crimes. First, through life insurance, and then by selling the remains of those he killed. Holmes later confessed to his murderous impulses, stating, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing." In 1896, after years of terrorizing Chicago, Holmes was finally caught and hanged for his crimes at Moyamensing Prison. Holmes' murder castle was a grotesque factory of death, where victims met their end, and their remains became commodities for science. Number 1, Ed Gein. Turned them into household goods. Ed Gein's gruesome crimes have cemented him as one of the most infamous figures in true crime history. His horrific acts inspired some of the most disturbing characters in popular culture, including Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Norman Bates from Psycho. Gein's obsession wasn't just about killing, it was about transforming his victims into something far more grotesque. After his mother, Augusta Gein, passed away in 1945, Ed was left devastated, having lost the only woman he ever truly loved. He became obsessed with recreating her in the most bizarre and horrifying way possible. Living alone on a remote farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin, Gein boarded up the rooms once used by his mother, preserving them as shrines while he resided in a small kitchen. His fixation with death led him to not only murder 2 women, but also rob the graves of recently deceased females. When detectives finally arrived at his home suspecting him in the disappearance of a local woman, what they discovered was beyond anyone's worst nightmare. Inside Gein's farmhouse, they found a decapitated body, jars filled with human organs, skulls fashioned into bedposts, a belt made from human nipples, a shoebox containing 9 vulvas and masks crafted from human skin. His house had become a macabre collection of body parts, all with the aim of reconstructing his late mother's likeness. Ed Gein was ultimately deemed unfit for trial and spent the rest of his life in a mental institution, dying at age 77. His horrifying legacy still haunts the annals of true crime. For Gein, murder was just the beginning. His obsession with the dead extended to turning his victims into grotesque household items, forever blurring the line between life and death. These killers didn't just take lives, they crossed into unimaginable horrors by desecrating their victims in some of the most grotesque ways possible. Which method sent shivers down your spine? Let us know in the comments below. If you're intrigued by the strange and sinister, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more unsettling content. Thanks for watching Odd Occasions, where the unusual is just the beginning.